Welcome to the Anime Audiophile Podcast. Please like and subscribe for more. Thank you. Kakashi Retsuden, the 6th Hokage and the Fail Prince. Prologue. Oh. The top finally. Itachi Kakashi sighed, sick of the whole endeavor after crawling up to the peak of a mountain face that was basically a sheer cliff. It had been 20 days since he'd left the land of fire. He'd been on the move day and night, and now the landscape and climate were entirely different from the country he'd left behind. There was nothing but rough wasteland as far as the eye could see, as though the landscape had been cracked in half with a palm strike. Beyond the bleak mountains, he could see what looked like an actual town, so small it nearly vanished in the distance. It was a long journey, but he was almost there. A couple more mountain crossings and he would at last arrive at his destination. I wonder if they have onsens. Judging from the harsh terrain, Kakashi knew his hope for an onsen was a futile one, but he held onto this bit of optimism as he slid down the cliff, heels digging into the face of the mountain and sending stones clattering. The cloak he had wrapped around him flapped as he marked out a dark green trail on the deep gray slope. He was on his way to the land of Ridaku, a city-state nestled quietly in a valley plain, hidden behind the peaks that rose up all around it. Almost completely cut off from the outside world, this country was half legend, and the countless songs sung about it stirred the imaginations of the people of the 5 great nations. The town was a sudden and bountiful oasis in what was otherwise the rock and sand of the mountains. Water and greenery were abundant and rich in this region throughout the 4 seasons, and the people lived out their days in peace and beauty, producing everything they needed as they had for centuries. In ancient times, the sage of the 6 paths himself had favored the place and convalesced there with the beasts that were his companions. This was the version of the land of Ridaku sung about in songs. However, the real land of Ridaku was far removed from the beatific world the poet sang of. Was this really that land of Ridaku? Kakashi furrowed his brow as he entered the capital and looked around. The town was still, as though possessed by demons. Each time the dry sandy wind kicked up, he caught the stench of dried corpses. The area was impossibly quiet. He didn't hear even a bird chirping, much less people talking. The bodies of skinny goats were piled up haphazardly on a cart abandoned by the side of the road, but they were not the only source of the foul smell. Long houses stood on both sides of the street, made of sun-dried bricks held together with mud, a technique characteristic of the region. From the size of the buildings, he guessed they were private homes, but the people who should have been living in them were nowhere to be found. Is there a famine? He had a bad feeling as he walked toward the center of town. This country was at an elevation of about 4,000 meters, and the air was thin. His lungs hitched and his breathing grew more shallow. He heard fabric rustling and the whistle of the wind, and his feet stopped. He turned his eyes in the direction of the sound and found a child lying on the ground beneath a now brown aspen tree. He raced over and picked the child up. He was first surprised by how light they were, and then by how skinny it was, like holding nothing but bones. He was further surprised at the sunken, mummy-like cheeks. The skin was oddly wrinkled, having lost its elasticity, and the burnished flesh of the cheeks looked stretched over the cheekbones, just barely sticking to the face. Malnutrition and dehydration. "Can you drink some water?" he asked softly, so as not to scare them. The child raised their heavy lids from their sunken eyes. Black pupils turned slowly toward Kakashi. But even this small movement was too painful, and they soon closed their eyes again. Kakashi took off his cloak and hung it on a branch to create some shade before kneading his chakra in the palm of his hands. With the water he created with water style, he moistened the child's mouth. A tongue white from malnutrition poked out from between lips to lap up the water, nearly lifeless. He had made barely enough water to fill the palm of his hand, but the child still took quite a long time to drink down even this small amount. He sat the small body up and leaned the child against the wall of one of the houses. The child thanked him in a tiny voice and then held up the lump of cloth against their chest. "Water for her too, please." Wrapped in the rough hemp cloth was the face of a baby. He gently touched the small ashen cheeks and found they were already cold. He kneaded his chakra once more and pretended to pour the round drop of water on his fingertips into the baby's slightly parted mouth. Most of the water was absorbed by the fabric instead, but perhaps mistaking this for the baby's drinking, the child closed their eyes again, reassured. Where were this child's parents? He opened the door of a nearby house. The inside was neat and tidied up, no sign of any violence. He grabbed several bowls in a corner of the room, created more water to fill them, and set the full bowls next to the child. Sorry. His voice was thick with the word. He didn't really know himself what he was apologizing for. The child was starving and the baby was dead. What on earth happened in this land? The state of the town center was even worse. Scattered corpses, nothing more than skin and bone, were covered with sand. Some were hastily wrapped in matting, others essentially exposed to the elements. The older bodies had turned black, their bellies stretched and distended, swollen with gas. The ones that were still fresh had skin dotted with blisters that seemed to have sprung up from the inside. The only saving grace was that he saw no murdered corpses and that the dead were unlooted, their possessions remained on them. At the very least, he knew that there had been no violence or slaughter. He slipped past a row of long houses and had come out onto an open road when he finally found a living adult. An old woman with a bent back, carrying hay. Haven't seen you before, she said, before Kakashi could call out to her. You don't live around here. Where on earth did you come from? He come to the land of Ridaku at the request of the 7th Hokage. The details were top secret, of course, and he couldn't very well reveal his true identity to a random resident of the town. Where do you think I came from? You do ask strange questions, The old woman frowned. Well, let's see. Your clothes are real dusty, so I'd say you came from over the mountain. You from Nagar? You guessed it. Kakashi nodded, going along with the woman. Look at that. Got it on the first try. She bared yellow teeth as she laughed out loud. No wonder you look so well. They say Nagare's got plenty of water still. Can't tell you how jealous I am. Where is everyone else? The adults went to draw water, far off. I'm holding down the fort here since I'd only be in the way. Just to go and come back takes half a day, after all. The old woman shrugged to adjust the bale of hay on her back and then sighed heavily. Honestly, the flooding finally ends, and now we don't have any water. A string of bad luck since the old king died. Kakashi was stunned. The king died? You didn't know? The old woman looked at him curiously. Right around this time last year. Suddenly. Lots of rumors about how he caught sick or it was something he ate, but who knows what the truth of it is. So who's ruling the land now? His oldest daughter, Lady Manari, inherited his throne. She eyed him suspiciously. Now I know you're from Nagar, but how could you not know that? I've been ill for a long time, he said simply. Ah, that's terrible. The old woman smiled sympathetically. When did the drought start? Kakashi asked. The crease between the old woman's brows deepened. I'd rather not say so, but as it happens, after Manari became queen, the rain just stopped. The people who had gone to fetch water returned in the afternoon, bearing buckets hanging from poles stretched across their shoulders. Youths barely out of childhood carried jugs and pots in both hands. When was the last time it rained? A man muttered, shrugging. They all seemed utterly exhausted after the very long return trip. As Kakashi helped them with their burdens, he lowered his eyes to the contents of one bucket. Fine grit and moss were mixed in with the water that had been carried from some last hope of a well far, far away, and he had serious doubts about anyone actually drinking this stuff. We've got no choice but to drink it. There's no other water, a tan young woman said with a bitter smile when she saw Kakashi fish out the corpses of mosquito larvae floating on the water's surface. You said you're from Nagar? Must have been a real surprise to see the capital like this. All the water sources in the valley are drying up. There's almost nowhere left for us to get water. Just one place now, a pond in the shadows that's still holding on. But it'll dry up soon enough. And when it does, that's the end of this town. We could try and run away, but we got no horses. A man sighed and looked up at the sky. If it doesn't rain soon, we're all going to die. At this altitude, they were closer to the sky than the ocean, which was perhaps why the sky was a deep, clear blue, like a curtain had been pulled across it. Threads of clouds on the verge of disappearing slowly slid past. Kakashi dropped his gaze to the cracked yellow earth. Not enough. Water. According to the intel he'd been given, it was the job of the royal ruler to wet the land in this dry region. The king used a tool called the shoigu, which was handed down through generations of the royal family, to control water and make it rain. Kakashi looked up at the stone palace rising from the center of the city. Given that this tool clearly wasn't functioning properly, the problem most likely lay there. Eventually, when the sun's light angled off and the boundary between shadow and light grew vague, he saw a lamp light up on the top floor of the palace. Although it was still light enough outside and the birds were still happily flying around, a precious lamp had already been lit, so that was most likely the royal quarters. Much like the Hokage's office, it was in a relatively high location so that people could see where their leader was. After waiting for the sky to deepen into a black blue, Kakashi climbed the castle walls that were shrouded with the darkness. He peered into the lit room in question and discovered that he had been right. Standing in the center of the room was a girl in an orange gown, the symbol of the royal family. Queen Manari. She was maybe in her mid-teens. Straight black hair hung down past her shoulders. He couldn't get a good look at her face because her gaze was turned downward. Her hands gripped a golden staff with a ring attached to the top of it. So that's the shoigu, Kakashi murmured. He'd heard of it, but this was the first time he'd seen it. There was one other person in the room, an elderly man wearing a crimson religious robe and an ash-colored beard that reached his chest. Your Majesty, you must decide, the man pressed the queen, his tone firm. Judging by the peonies embroidered in gold thread on the chest of his robe, he was probably the prime minister, the king's right hand, and the most powerful person in the land outside of the royal family. Each day more people starve to death. It's only a matter of time until the famine reaches the outlying towns. In fact, it's already too late, but we must still devise the optimal strategy going forward. Of course, I want to do that. But how am I supposed to? Minari's hand trembled, and the metal decorations hanging from the shoigu ring jangled. I know I must use the shoigu. But I can't muster the courage, not while I'm not sure I can control it. With all due respect, the Prime Minister said in a husky voice. You needn't force yourself to use a tool you cannot master. If, as you fear, you lose control of it and bring about another flood, we could see more than just our crops washed away this time. If our capital is destroyed, the country will fall into a state of dysfunction. But the kings of this land have used the shoigu for centuries to wet the earth. They could do it, so I'm sure Queen Manari. The Prime Minister sighed pointedly and stared hard at the girl from beneath heavy eyelids. The records note that those generations of kings had mastered the shoigu from the moment they first picked it up. No one taught them how to use it, they clearly could wield it the instant they touched it. But, unfortunately, that is not the case for you. Peering at Minari's pale face, the Prime Minister continued in a gentle, reassuring tone. This is not your fault, my queen. Most likely, some innate ability is required to handle the shoigu, and you are simply not born with this. There is no need for you to pointlessly fixate on a tool you are not suited to. If you cannot produce water using the shoigu, then we must simply find another way to procure the water we need. The Prime Minister walked toward the window, so Kakashi pulled back. He heard the Prime Minister's feet stop. The other man would have been looking down on the capital from the window at the same scene Kakashi was seeing. Tiled roofs covered in clouds of sand sinking into the sooty night shadows. Wood fires burned here and there on the roads, where people gathered to take warmth. Even on this parched earth, the citizens were desperately trying to survive. But they likely wouldn't last much longer if this drought kept up. Nanera hasn't tried the shoiku yet. He might be able to use it, Manari said lifelessly from inside the room. The Prime Minister snorted with laughter, still looking down at the town. What would you have us ask that failure to do? Prime Minister, that's quite rude. For the first time, Manari's voice was slightly sharp. Nanera is my little brother and a member of the royal family. Even now. I do apologize, my queen. My true feelings accidentally slipped out. The Prime Minister offered this politely insolent apology and cleared his throat before continuing. Prince Nanera currently makes his residence in Nagar. I am told that he hardly studies at all and instead merely plays every day. He does make things difficult. He's likely not the one who can master the shoiku. We cannot rely on him. Directly facing the Queen, the domineering Prime Minister pressed her again. Your Majesty. Your decision. Manari fell silent and was almost frozen in place for a moment, but eventually, she squeezed out the words, I understand. I won't use the shoiku again. I will do as you say. I will do what I can for the sake of this land. Then it's settled. The Prime Minister nodded indulgently and clasped his aged palms together in front of his chest. If there is no water within the country, then we will have to take it from another land. We shall go to war. This was not a good situation. After descending the wall with none the wiser of his eavesdropping, Kakashi leaned back against it and considered things. He'd come this far to collect some information. But he felt that he couldn't walk away from this. The country was in ruins and the people starving because of a man-made disaster, and yet the idiot Prime Minister was planning to go to war with another country, of all the foolishness. At present, he couldn't say much about Manari's inability to use the shoiku. There was probably some condition required to activate it, like it could only be used by men or the user had to make a contract with it, as with a summoning technique. Because the previous king had died suddenly, the conditions for use might not have been correctly conveyed to her. Can't know anything without checking it out, Kakashi muttered to himself and looked back at the palace. The Prime Minister probably ruled the inside of that building with an iron fist. It would no doubt take a while to reach the Queen by disguising himself as a lady-in-waiting or a government official. But according to the Prime Minister, Manari's younger brother lived in the village of Nagar. It might be a whole lot easier to approach the boy instead. The Prime Minister wouldn't have as many eyes that far away from the palace, and more than anything else, just hearing about this failed prince got him all worked up as the former Jonin leading Team 7. The old woman he met that afternoon said it was about 3 days by horse from the capital to Nagar. On Kakashi's legs, he could likely reach it in a few hours. The issue was how to make contact. The wind that was rustling the leaves of the apricot tree smelled of fresh grass. Nanera, the eldest son of the previous king, was racing around the field with his playmate Sumire. Ha. Foul 6 Hokage. Today you meet your doom. Ha. Momochi Zabuza. You better apologize right now or you'll be in real trouble. You're powerless before me. Here I go. Water style. Super. Exploding fabric. Shaya. HNGH. If you're going to do that, then I release purple lightning. Bwan. Kreia Ash. They were playing 6 Hokage. Surprised by their noisy footfalls, the grasshoppers sprang off, scattering the morning dew as they went. Prepare yourself, Zabuza. Earth style. Mud wall. Sumire picked up a fallen tree branch and waved it around. Nanera's face suddenly grew dark, and he glared at Sumire as though his friend had completely wrecked everything. Come on, Sumire, be serious. Mud wall is a defensive technique that creates a huge wall of earth. But you look like you're tossing a bunch of kunai around. Oh, it is? Sumire frowned. What was the jutsu to summon the ninja dogs again? Asterisk. That's the Fang Vengeance technique. Honestly, you don't remember anything. Nanera sighed, completely exasperated. Mud Wall and Fang Vengeance were both super famous techniques that appeared over and over in the stories about the 6 Hokage. So why couldn't Sumire remember them? It was so annoying. You just remember everything too well, Nanera, Sumire muttered. Sulking, he tossed the tree branch to the ground. I mean, how much do you love your precious 6 Hokage anyway? Fine. I'm the 6 Hokage now. Nanera shouted. Sumire, you're going down. What? The other boy cried. I wanted to be Hokage a little longer though. No. It's my turn. The words were no sooner out of his mouth than Nanera was clenching his hands into fists and charging Sumire. Crack, 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 crack. Lightning style. Lightning blade. He thrust a fist out at Sumire's chest. Whoa! Critical high hit. Sumire reeled dramatically and collapsed on the grassy field. Nanera immediately jumped on top of him and began tickling him. Blah! Ha ha! Ha 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 ha! Stop! Stop it! Not to be outdone, Sumire tickled Nanera in return. The two boys shook with laughter, rolling around like rice balls on the grass. They've been playing at being the Hokage again since morning. Never gets old for them. I just know Nanera started it. He devours all those stories about the 6 Hokage. The villagers watched the boys as they led their goats back to the farm. It was getting to be a year now since Nanera had come to Nagar. He used to live in the palace in the capital with his father and older sister. But after his father died suddenly and his sister inherited the throne, he came to the village. The palace is a place of politics, inappropriate for a child. Better for Prince Nanera to grow up more leisurely in the countryside. For instance, what about the village of Nagar? Even Nanera, a child, knew that the Prime Minister was politely chasing him out of the city. But that was fine by him. He had had enough of being surrounded by pompous grown-ups and locked up in the stuffy palace. Here, he had friends his age, and the grown-ups all talked to him in a friendly way, so he could forget that he was part of the royal family. He could run around in the field playing 6 Hokage and get the adults to tell him about the legend of the 6 Hokage. He had had so much fun every day since he came to Nagar that he could hardly stand it. Nanera really does love the 6 Hokage, the villagers would say with a laugh. And Nanera would feel proud every time, sticking out his chest and grinning. The 6 Hokage was a legendary ninja. Ninja were these special people who could use amazing jutsu. In the land of fire, a place far from the land of Ridaku, super far to the east, there were supposedly a whole bunch of powerful ninja. And the 6 Hokage was the super charismatic leader of overwhelming amazingness that tied all those ninja together. The 6 Hokage is just a fairy tale when it comes down to it. Sometimes, the villagers would say malicious things like this. No one can actually manipulate earth and lightning. And it's not just the 6 Hokage. I very much doubt whether the land of fire itself exists. At times like this, Nanera would always reply with all the strength he had within him, that's not true. The 6 Hokage definitely, really, for sure does exist. He's alive right now, the ninja leader of the land of fire. Don't be ridiculous. If ninja really exist, then how do they make lightning out of nothing? They just... He was stuck, though, when they pushed him for details. The tale of the 6 Hokage was a legend, so he was unclear on the specifics. The stories only ever said that Lightning Blade was lightning jutsu so powerful it could cut lightning and that it made a sound like 1,000 birds. So, playing Hokage, it was important to use their imaginations to fill in the details. Nanera knew that most of the adults thought that the sixth Hokage was only a person in stories and didn't really exist. But, right. The ninja are just amazing, so they can do anything. They can create lightning. Fire even. Dad said they could, so it has to be true. Nanera would argue so sincerely and earnestly that the villagers would end up smiling and agreeing that he was right, and it must be so. His father had taught him about the legend of the sixth Hokage. The king of the land of Ridaku would find moments in his busy days, set Nanera on his knee, and tell him stories about the sixth Hokage. The battle to the death with Momochi Zabuza, his fight with the evil organization Akatsuki. After pinning his enemies up against a wall with clever maneuvering, the sixth Hokage would lash out with the incredible lightning blade technique powerful enough to cut lightning. Plus, he had fire-style and earth-style jutsu that were just as powerful. His father's retelling of the legend of the Hokage always got him more excited than anything else. For Nanera, the sixth Hokage was the stuff of dreams. Prince Nanera, how long are you going to play exactly? When Margot came running after him, the hem of her skirt flapping. Nanera was in the middle of a serious contest. He had yanked up a slender Spanish needle growing in the field and was brandishing it like a sword, about to cut down Samir, who was playing the part of Zabuza. What, Margot? We were just at a good part. It's time for your studies. Come back right now, she snapped, and Samir's shoulders slumped. But Nanera didn't move. He was long used to Margot's shouting. A tall woman in her mid-20s, she lived with Nanera and took care of him. Formally, at any rate, she was a maid under direct orders from the Prime Minister, but Margot was different from the maids at the palace. She kept an eye on Nanera, and if he failed to finish his supper or neglected his chores, she would come flying at him with rebukes. If she discovered one of his pranks, she would give him a sharp rap on the head with her knuckles. She was more a scary aunt than a maid. I'm not studying today. There's no one to teach me. Nanera stuck his chest out and announced. He was still a member of the royal family, so the rule was he would have a tutor. The one sent from the capital by the Prime Minister had been an incredibly quiet woman. At first, she was delighted, talking about what an honor it was to be the prince's personal tutor, but when Nanera slipped a newt down her back as a joke, she burst into tears, and the next morning, she packed her things and left. Since then, any number of tutors had come, but none of them had stayed more than 2 weeks. The middle-aged man who'd arrived recently had fallen into the trap Nanera dug out, broken his glasses, and stormed out of the place. That had been a week ago. I don't have a teacher, so I can't study. So I can just play, Nanera said, full of confidence. Margot looked down at him with a smile. You do, though, have a new tutor. That stupid Prime Minister. He already sent a new tutor? Nanera was quite indignant at having his fun with Samir spoiled just when it was getting good. Well, fine. If he pulled a bit of a prank, the new teacher would certainly flee in tears. He's waiting in the living room, Margot said, and headed into the kitchen to make tea. Nanera pulled off his muddy shoes and went into the living room. There was someone on the wood stool set against the wall. You're late, Prince Nanera. Calm, low voice. The someone sitting on the chair slowly turned toward him. He was backlit from the window behind him, and he couldn't really make out his face. But he could tell from the silhouette that it was a tall man. The tips of his silver hair glittered and shone dazzlingly in the light of the sun, and Nanera narrowed his eyes as if he was looking at a watchfire in an iron basket. You're my new tutor? He asked, deliberately arrogant, as he crossed his arms. The beginning was crucial in all things. He was a child, but he wouldn't allow anyone to look down on him. The man stood up from the chair without a sound. My name is Hatake Kakashi. Weird name. Especially the family name. Kakashi moved toward him, and finally, Nanera could see his face. He was a dreamy man with heavy-lidded, sleepy-looking eyes. Chapter 1. A sloppy man. That was his first impression of his new tutor. Sleepy, goat-like eyes, messy hair. Mild, low voice, and a strangely laid-back way of speaking. This would be almost too easy, Nanera decided at a glance. Itachi Kakashi? He glared up at the man's face menacingly. Too bad for you, I'm not interested in studying. There's only one thing I want from my tutors. He jumped onto a chair and looked up at Kakashi with shining eyes. Tell me about the legend of the sixth Hokage. The sixth, what? Nanera pouted, a crease popping up on his brow. The sixth Hokage. You know, the hero of the Land of Fire? What's that about? It's a person? Kakashi asked in reply, cocking his head to one side. Nanera's eyes at last grew round in surprise. You mean, you really don't know who the sixth Hokage is? First I've heard of it. Kakashi shrugged. This sixth whatever, are they famous? Super famous. Everybody knows who he is. Nanera clenched his small hands into fists and thrust his chest out proudly, as if he were the famous one. The sixth Hokage is the most powerful shinobi. And the greatest leader. Kakashi's reaction was somehow lacking. Nanera pinched his lips together. He couldn't believe that this man didn't know who the sixth Hokage was. What a waste of a life. He thought everyone in the land of Ridaku had heard the legend of the sixth Hokage at least once. And here was this ignorant fool who didn't even know his name, even though he was supposed to be a tutor. Well, fine. Nanera pulled himself together. Then today, I will tell you the story of the sixth Hokage. Nah, I'm good. The rejection was quick and smooth. Now then, let's get to your studies. That's why I'm here, after all. A tutor's most important duty is to tell me stories about the sixth Hokage, Nanera sniffed. Kakashi raised an eyebrow at this. What did your previous tutors teach you? I told you. They told me stories about the sixth Hokage. Anything else? And, let me play. Is that so? Kakashi lowered his eyes and nodded. It seems your tutors have been sent only for show up until now. The Prime Minister doesn't have any interest in making you learn anything. He stood up and gave the room a once-over. I don't see anything along the lines of books in this house. Do you need books? Nanera frowned. They're in the library, but it's locked right now. We can't go inside. The Prime Minister ordered them locked about 6 months ago. He did? He said it was to preserve the books. Because they'll get damaged and dirty if everyone's using them. The library had once been open all the time, and everyone was welcome to read whatever book they wanted. But the door had remained firmly shut ever since the order to lock it came down. I see, Kakashi muttered, looking around the room once more. Well, show me where it is at least. The village of Nagar was built into the wall of a ravine. You couldn't get anywhere unless you went up or down a hill. The library stood alone at the top of the slope. The cliff rose up behind it, and a watchtower stood to one side to look out over the valley. This was the end of the village. See? Nanera said. We can't go in. It's closed. The library was surrounded by a low hedge fence, and a chain hung between the two pillars at the front gate to prevent anyone passing through. The entrance to the building on the other side was closed tight with a brass deadbolt. So it would seem, Kakashi said as he stepped over the chain. Hey! Nanera cried in surprise. What are you planning to do? I mean, it's all locked up. You can't get inside. Kakashi walked ahead and gently touched the keyhole on the door. Then he reached for the handle and pulled the door to the side. It was supposedly locked, and yet for some reason it clattered open. Kakashi! Stop! Nanera shouted. Kakashi looked back just as he was about to step into the library. It's illegal to go inside. Even the royal family would be punished. As long as no one finds out, we're all good. And if they do find out, we can just apologize, Kakashi said, and stepped inside before Nanera could stop him. Left with no other choice, the boy chased after him. He touched the front door and yanked his hand back in surprise. Oh! The brass lock built into the wooden door was incredibly hot. It was almost as if the inside of the keyhole had been melted with a powerful flame. Was that why the lock had opened? Kakashi, wait up. Nanera timidly peered inside. It was packed with tall bookshelves. Although sunlight came in through the windows, his eyes hadn't adjusted yet, and the space was dim and gloomy. The smell of old parchment and dust filled the room. Nanera trotted after Kakashi and grabbed the hem of his jacket. Where'd all that bravado from before go? Kakashi asked, looking down at him. It's just... The decision to lock the library had been made by the Prime Minister, which meant it had been his older sister Minari's decision. He felt a little guilty at disobeying her. Kakashi let out a short sigh and then said, as if to himself, it's important to obey rules and regulations. But it's just as important for you to read books. Well, it's basically a matter of self-discipline. Self-discipline? What's that? He didn't understand the difficult word. It means you have the power to pull yourself up and keep going when it looks like you're going to lose at something, Kakashi said, as he turned toward the bookshelves and began picking through the books. Standing and watching him was pretty boring, so Nanera wandered around, kicking up dust and looking for the book he wanted. He wasn't interested in actually reading a book, but that book should have been in there somewhere. Kakashi. I found it. Nanera held up a yellowed-bound volume. It's the 6th Hokage book. I can't believe you managed to find it, his tutor remarked. I can tell from the picture, he said. The cover of any book with stories about the 6th Hokage always had the same mark, a twisting spiral with a small triangle on the bottom left. He didn't really know what it was a picture of, but he was sure it was the 6th Hokage's trademark. The two of them returned to the house, loaded with several volumes Kakashi had selected and the 6th Hokage book. They plopped down to sit cross-legged on the rug in the living room and faced each other across the low table. Where shall we start then, H.M.? Kakashi flipped through the books he brought, and Nanera gasped. What? When did this turn into a classroom? Kakashi, he shouted. I'm not doing any studying. Even if we use this book? Kakashi set the bound book with the spiral on the low table. Instantly, Nanera relaxed. Only if it's this book. Now, read it. What are you talking about? Kakashi replied. You're going to read it. I'm going to sit and listen. Huh? I can't read, though. It's the tutor's job to read. Is it then? Well, I guess we should start with learning how to read and write. Nanera cocked his head to one side, baffled. A few seconds later, he realized what Kakashi was saying, and his eyes grew round. Learn? The characters? Yes. All of them? Yes. But there are so many. As proof that he wasn't joking, Kakashi did not smile. He picked up a sheet of the straw paper on the table and quickly wrote a few characters on it. This is your name. Nanera. Nanera propped his chin in his hands and stared at the handwriting before him, clearly set out as an example for him to follow. It's surprisingly simple, you know, Kakashi urged. Reluctantly, Nanera gave in and began to copy the characters. He supposed it wasn't a bad idea to learn his own name at least. There was absolutely no way he could learn all of the characters, but he could manage somehow if it was just the two characters Na and Ra. He copied each one diligently, frequently referencing the characters Kakashi had written on one side of the page. When he'd done this 3 times, Kakashi grabbed another piece of straw paper. Now try to write it without looking at the example. Brush in hand, Nanera was stumped. He'd written it 3 times, but he couldn't remember anything. How did the first character go again? He was pretty sure it started with a horizontal line. Wait. Was that the next character? He was getting all tangled up. His power of concentration diminished quickly, and he turned his eyes wearily toward the window. It was really nice outside. Why did he have to be cooped up in the house on such a sunny day learning how to write? He started to get annoyed. He couldn't remember the Na of Nanera at all. And why was he even doing this in the first place? Whatever. We're done. He crumpled up the straw paper in front of him and jumped to his feet. The lesson is over. It's way more fun to play war with everyone else. Me and Stock are the Western Army, Chaemon and Archie are the Eastern Army. I'll let you be the referee. The Eastern Army and the Western Army? Kakashi gazed absently at the sunlight streaming in the window. The weather's so good today. I'm sure the Eastern Army will win. Nanera was completely bowled over. War was a game where you split into 2 teams and tried to take the other's headbands. The Eastern Army winning just because the weather was good, it totally, absolutely, definitely didn't make any sense. Don't say stupid stuff. Let's go. He grabbed Kakashi's wrist and started to march away. But Kakashi didn't budge, so he ended up leaning so far forward, he nearly fell over. Oi! What are you doing? Let's go already. Kakashi easily removed his wrist from Nanera's grip and let out a short sigh. I won't force you. But reading would be better. Someone else will read to me, so it doesn't matter, he sniffed. That's what the Prime Minister said when I was still in the capital. Well, I'll be here, so feel free to come back if you change your mind. Old fogey. Nanera wasn't going to change his mind. He pursed his lips together in a pout and raced out of the house. But then he turned back and peered in through the living room window. Kakashi's a big stupid he yelled and threw his hands up. Kakashi didn't reply or chase after him. He merely flipped the pages of a book casually, elbows on the low table. If he's not going to play with me, then he's useless. Nanera stomped his feet angrily and ran toward the open field. Who was the winner? Kakashi asked when he at last returned to the house. The Eastern Army, he replied unhappily. They were, Kakashi turned his eyes back to the book he was reading. The armies had fought 3 times, and all 3 times, the Eastern Army had won, just like Kakashi said they would. Nanera was sure it was just a coincidence. There were only the 2 options, Eastern Army or Western Army. It was obvious that his random guess happened to hit the mark. After Nanera changed out of his dirty clothes, he helped with lunch, and then devoured it. He was going horseback riding with Samir in the afternoon now that his friend was back from grazing the animals. Kakashi. I'm not doing any lessons this afternoon either, he very deliberately announced. Kakashi finally closed his book and looked at his student. You'd be better off giving up on horse riding today. He almost asked how Kakashi knew that and hurried to swallow the words. Instead, he said, you've got no right to tell me anything. He snapped his index finger out and then ran outside as fast as he could. Sumir looked up from the horses in surprise when Nanera arrived. I was waiting just in case, but I thought you wouldn't come. You have a new tutor, right? I do, but that doesn't matter, Nanera replied. I'm ignoring him. What's he like? Sumir asked. The village aunties are talking about him. They say he's tall and handsome. Handsome? Not a chance. Nanera rolled his eyes, although he did think Kakashi was cooler than any of the adults in the village. He covered the lower half of his face with a mask, but even so, Nanera could tell he was cool. But only his face. He's boring. He doesn't even know who the sixth Hokage is. Seriously? What's the point then? Yeah, no point at all. They took the horses out to the plains southwest of the village. Straddling the saddle, Nainara kicked hard at his horse's flanks, while the falcon Ray flapped his wings to fly alongside the racing horses. Ray was a descendant of the line of falcons that had been kept by generations of the royal family. The falcon's role was to bring the king's commands to the outlying villages, and Ray had come to Nagar with Nainara so that he could stay in contact with the palace. But no one ever sent letters, and Nainara couldn't write, so Ray was out of a job these days and flew as he wished through the skies of Nagar. "Sumir, let's go into the woods," Nainara shouted. "Oh, good idea. I got a feeling I'll find the perfect branch today." The pair yanked on their reins, thundered across the plains, and entered the woods. Slipping past the trees, they crossed the streams of snowmelt here and there, heading deeper into the woods. Nainara was pleased to see tiny leaves sprouting from the treetops and sap oozing from the bark of the trunks. Spring was springing in the forest. Sumir's horse nickered and snorted. "So, a new foal's on the way, and my dad said I can name it whatever I want," Sumir said. "You got any good ideas, Nainara?" "What about Pakin? The name of the fighting dog that served the sixth Hokage. It's a horse, not a dog. But he shoots beams of light out of his mouth. His eyes are sharp, and he's so big he can leap over a bear in a single bound." As they chatted about nothing important, Sumir's horse snorted once more. "Huh?" Sumir leaned forward to peer at his horse's face. "His nose is running." Abruptly, the horse reared up, with Sumir still on his back. He shook his head nervously from side to side and kicked anxiously before starting to buck wildly, like he was trying to throw his rider. "Oi! What? What are you doing? Stop it!" Sumir tugged on the reins, but not only did the horse not quiet, he grew increasingly agitated and whinnied loudly. Then he suddenly stopped moving before pawing repeatedly at the ground with his front hooves. With each stroke, the saddle rose up, and Sumir let go of the reins to clutch the horse's neck. It was only a matter of time before he was thrown. "Oi! Calm down!" Nainara jumped off his horse and approached the out-of-control horse, grabbing the slender reins. "What is wrong with you?" He yanked on the reins and the bridle came right off. The buckle fastening it in place had come loose. Nainara fell onto his backside from the force of it and slammed into a stump. The out-of-control horse turned toward him and reared. "Nainara! Watch out!" Sumir cried. Nainara tried to roll away, but his top was caught on the stump and he couldn't move. The thick hooves came down toward his face. He squeezed his eyes shut. In the next instant, a powerful gust of wind slammed into his side. It was sharp and cold, like a blade, but also silken and soft somehow. His small body was thrown up helplessly, and the collar of his jacket got caught on a tree branch. Just when he thought he'd be stuck hanging there, he slipped out of his jacket and crashed into the ground face first. He sat up, shaking his dazed head. He didn't really understand what had just happened. And then he saw Kakashi with his hand on the nose of the wild horse, calming it down. "Come on," I said, "calm down. Your nose is just a little itchy is all," he said, almost like he was talking to a person in the neighborhood, as he patted the horse's cheek. Strangely, this quieted the animal, and its swinging tail finally grew. "Still. Nainara, are you okay?" Sumir jumped down from his horse and raced over to him. Nainara's face throbbed painfully, but thanks to the wind that had knocked him out of the way, he was basically unharmed. "Kakashi," he said, "what are you doing here?" "I was just out for a walk, happened to pass by." Kakashi turned towards Sumir, combing the horse's mane with his fingers. "Does this boy belong to you?" "No." Sumir shook his head. "He's the neighbor's. Auntie Bayan's." Is that right? Please tell her horse has hay fever, so she should be careful in the spring. Kakashi said calmly and turned back toward Nanera. The wind's strong today, so pollen from all kinds of plants is in the air. It's not uncommon for horses in this area to be allergic to aspen pollen. Hay fever? And he turned that wild? Now that Nanera was thinking about it, he remembered that his sister had told him a long time ago that some people suddenly start sneezing in certain seasons because of plant pollen. But he thought it was a disease just for humans, not horses. The reason I thought the Eastern Army would win was because you went out in the morning, his tutor continued. The Western Army would have been facing the sun, so it would dazzle their eyes. Bawasha. The horse gave a very sad sneeze. Kakashi crouched down to meet Nanera's eyes and continued. This is the sort of thing that's written in books. Studying might be boring, but it can be surprisingly useful more than you'd think. And so, the next day, Nanera had a brush in his hand first thing in the morning. He looked at the examples Kakashi gave him and carefully wrote each character, memorizing the shapes. Kakashi checked his work with comments like, "Don't stop there. Extend the brush stroke." It wasn't that he yielded to Kakashi. Absolutely not. But now that he knew books had all kinds of things he didn't know in them, he had decided that he would get so he could read at least. What had the wind yesterday been about? It had knocked him flying at the exact perfect moment and saved him from the rampaging horse. Almost like the jutsu of a ninja. What if the sixth Hokage had been watching from somewhere and saved him? Your hand stopped, Kakashi remarked, and Nanera hurried to move the brush along the page again. The man was flipping through books and drinking butter tea, but he was still watching to see whether Nanera was properly focused on the work. How infuriating. Prince Nanera, it's time to make lunch. Mr. Kakashi, would you help too? Margot came in to say, and the lesson stopped for the time being. Once the sun reached its highest position, the women of the village would come together and start to cook. And not just lunch. They would also make enough food for supper and breakfast the next morning. The village's communal hearth was outside, and it was dangerously dark to cook once night fell, so they made all their meals at once. Nanera ripped up tea leaves as instructed by Margot and glanced over at Kakashi. He was pumping air into the stove with a bellows, in charge of the fire. Nanera could tell that Margot and the women of the village were sneaking peeks at Kakashi as they peeled and chopped vegetables. He also knew that they said he was a fine man. It wasn't the whole cool thing of him wearing a mask, but maybe because his features were nicely balanced, he did look somehow like a painting standing there. Ah! This jerk. Nanera tossed the tea leaves into the mixer. He added salt and butter and then turned the handle to mix it all up when Ray, who should have been on the perch in the living room, came swooping down. Ray! He flew right past Nanera and came to rest on Kakashi's arm. Kakashi tossed him some of the dried meat on the cutting board, and he deftly caught it in his beak, swallowing it down in an instant. And then, as if to say more please, he rubbed his head against Kakashi's side. Mr. Kakashi, please, a woman said. I know he's the royal hawk, but don't go giving Ray snacks. He was just pestering me is all. Honestly. You're too nice, the women happily teased him. It was like Kakashi had somehow completely tamed Margot, Ray, and everyone else. He was a newcomer, but he had already made himself at home in the village. Maybe this Kakashi was someone seriously amazing. Maybe he should listen to him a little more. Nanera turned his gaze toward Kakashi with this thought in his head and saw that the pot on the stove was boiling over. Kakashi wasn't paying it the slightest mind, focused as he was on Ray. Kakashi, the pot's boiling over, Nanera said, and Kakashi finally turned his face toward the stove. Ah, he cried when he noticed the burbling pot. He hurriedly stood up and reached out for the now handles of the iron pot with his bare hands. Oh! He yanked his hands back. A few women came over, laughing, and tossed sand on the fire to get it to burn a little less hot. You have to watch what you're doing, Mr. Kakashi. The amply built anti-Bion hit him on the back, and Kakashi smiled awkwardly. He took it back. Kakashi was too absent-minded, he couldn't count on him. And he wouldn't do what Nanera wanted. Such an annoying jerk. I'll never fall all over Kakashi like everyone else. Nanera shouted to himself and turned the mixer handle forcefully. His afternoon lesson was not to practice reading and writing, but actually reading a book. I think this book would be good. The Tale of the Hokage is a no-go. Kakashi rejected the book Nanera held out excitedly without even a glance at the cover. Why? He cried. Too many difficult characters. We'll start with something simpler. Kakashi set a book with a wooden cover on the low table. When he opened it, the pages unfolded around each other and turned into a single large sheet of paper. Wow! A trick book. Nanera leaned forward. The page was covered with pictures of mountains, oceans, and rivers, and dotted with a variety of characters making what he assumed were words, although he couldn't read them. This is a map, Kakashi told him. It shows you which countries and villages are where and where the roads are. This one page collects all that in one place. See? These are the mountains. Which one's Nagar? Nanera asked. It's right here. Kakashi pointed at the left edge of the map. There was just a bit of text there, all alone in the slight gap where mountain met mountain. So then where's the capital? Around here. Kakashi pointed at the same place as before. Nanera cocked his head to one side, baffled. What are you talking about? That's Nagar. They're the same on the map. Huh? He didn't get it. The world is incredibly large. On a map, the distance between the capital and Nagar is very small, so they're basically in the same place. Ha ha ha. He didn't think the joke was very funny, but he was kind enough to laugh anyway. However, Kakashi's face remained serious. No. That was impossible. It takes 3 days to reach the capital, you know, he said finally. I do. Kakashi nodded. But the world is even bigger than you think. It would take a lot longer than that to walk from one side of the continent to the other. Nanera stared hard at the map. If he were to believe Kakashi, the little blurred lines on the page were apparently the whole of his country. What about the Land of Fire? Is it on here? It's right here. Kakashi pointed to the right edge of the page. The Land of Fire was apparently one of the lumps next to the ocean, silhouetted by the dividing lines drawn across the large continent. What? It's that far away? Given that the scale of the map essentially erased the distance between the capital and Nagar, the distance between the land of Ridaku and the Land of Fire defied imagination. It's super far, huh? Nanera propped his chin in his hands and stared at the map. The Land of Fire is surrounded by so many countries, but the Land of Ridaku is all alone up in the mountains. It's kind of disappointing. You think so? I mean, it's like we're hiding in a corner, living our lives, which is kind of boring, right? It's pretty tough to have neighbors nearby. Kakashi said. It leads to quarrels. It does? Even as he asked this, something clicked in Nanera's head. The first time he'd been in a fistfight was after he came to this village and made a friend his own age. This is just my own thinking, Kakashi said as a premise before continuing. But maybe the reason your ancestors formed their country out here was to avoid fighting. This country has been at peace all this time, right? You've never had a war? Indeed, as far as Nanera had heard, the Land of Ridaku had never fought with another country. Naturally. Because they didn't have anything to do with other countries to start with. For Nanera and the people of the Land of Ridaku, war was something that only happened in stories in the far-off world. I think that was a brave choice, Kakashi said. Avoiding fighting saves more people than winning battles. Nanera dropped his eyes to the map. There were only large countries around the Land of Fire. The Land of Earth and the village of Kirigakure were certainly nearby. You think the Land of Fire is fighting lots of wars even now? He asked. No. I think the danger of a war breaking out between the Land of Fire and other countries is much less than it was in the past. Huh? Nanera lifted his head. How come? Because everyone knows the pain and sacrifices they will make in war are much greater than whatever they might gain, Kakashi said, looking not at the map but at Nanera. Only a few decades ago, what was most needed to maintain peace in the Land of Fire was strength. The ninja were originally a tool to attack other countries and to protect their own country. Nanera nodded. It was true that the ninja appearing in the legends of the sixth Hokage were always fighting someone. Including the Hokage, of course. Once the major wars ended and there was some peace, the Land of Fire began actively trading with the countries around it. And then they started being able to make things. They started making one new thing after another, and their society grew rich. Trading? Nanera didn't know this word. He felt like he had maybe heard it from his father before. Or maybe not. It might not be a word that's very familiar in this land, Kakashi told him. It means countries buying and selling things from and to each other. Everyone has something different that they're good at making. So, you trade what you have with someone else. That way, you can get all kinds of things. Oh. Makes sense, Nanera muttered to himself. In Nagar, the villagers often traded things. If war with another land starts and trading stops, then you stop being able to get hardly anything at all, and you can't stay as rich as you were. Everyone gets poorer, and a lot of people die. If you make that sacrifice and you're lucky enough to win the war, you can force the other country to submit to you. So, what does the winner get? Nanera thought for a second. They get to feel good about winning. And be cool. Is that all? No. He paused again. If they chase the people in the losing country out, they can have all of their things. Kakashi nodded. The Land of Fire already has more than enough things, so if there was anything they'd want, it'd be land, natural resources, or technology. But they don't have to go to the trouble of starting a war for that. They can buy land, resources, and technology with money. It's much less dangerous to buy something with money than take it by force, and no one has to die. A lot of times it's cheaper than fighting. Nanera nodded, squirming in his seat. That's true. Once this way of thinking becomes almost automatic for each and every one of the people in a country, the probability of a war breaking out goes way down. Although there's economic fighting in its place. So then, there aren't any more ninja in the Land of Fire? Kakashi shook his head. The Ninja Academy still exists to teach the ninja who protect the country. And they haven't eradicated crime. Plus, some terrorist groups try to upset the balance among the nations. Still, I guess it's safe to say that the fear of a major war has basically vanished. So long as the country's leaders don't make too huge of a blunder. Or a new group doesn't come onto the scene, filled with evil intent and in possession of power great enough to rival that of the countries. Kakashi smiled. That's what I read in the books from the library, anyway. Nanera let out the breath he'd been holding. His head was swimming after hearing so much at one time. There's a lot of stuff written in books, huh? The legend of the sixth Hokage went like this. During the time of the sixth Hokage, the Land of Fire saw unprecedented economic development and grew rapidly. In other words, the sixth Hokage had created this world that Kakashi told him about today, where war was unlikely. The sixth Hokage really is amazing. Thinking about this, he could no longer contain himself. He clutched his blanket and rolled around on the floor. He was so ridiculously happy to have learned another new thing about how amazing the sixth Hokage was that his heart kept pounding louder and louder, and he didn't feel at all sleepy. He sat up and stared at the map in the light of the moon. He thought studying was boring. But maybe it was just a little bit fun. That night, Nanera spread out the map and set it up next to his sleeping mat. Now he could look at it as he went to sleep. In the spot where the land of fire was, he had added a 6th Hokage mark in bright red ink. He dove into his futon, pulling the blankets up to his nose, and stared at the spiral mark, getting excited over just that. More and more, he looked forward to his lessons with Kakashi with each passing day. "I'd much rather quit all this stupid studying and go outside and play, you know." Although he went through the motions every morning, his voice had lost the thorniness of that first day. Studying was not very cool, and he wanted to look as annoyed and bored as he could. But his excitement for what Kakashi would teach him that day grew greater than his desire to look cool, and the corners of his mouth would sometimes curl up into a smile. After 5 days of study, he could read quite a few characters. And the more he could read, the more he wanted to read. He read all kinds of books with Kakashi's help. Kakashi taught him so many things each day. Which crops grew well in summer, which grew well in winter. He told him about ways to keep harvests from rotting, the relationships the major countries had with each other, and which things could change society in what ways. And a whole bunch of other stuff. His tutor knew a lot of things, but there were spots where his knowledge was curiously lacking. It wasn't just the 6th Hokage, he didn't know how to make butter tea or sugar cookies either. At times like that, Nanera would teach him about the monarchy, about the prime minister, the queen. 10 days passed from the day Kakashi had appeared before Nanera. And before he knew it, it was the night of the parade of the 6 lanterns. A custom long practiced in Nagar, 6 butter lamps were put onto boats made of Matsubusa vines and sent down the river. Nanera and Kakashi crouched down at the edge of the small river that ran through the village and waited for each lamp to flow down from upstream. "That one that went by before, how many does that make?" Kakashi asked. 4, I think, Nanera said. "Maybe." It was said that misfortune would befall you if you didn't see off all of the lamps. But there was really no basis for this belief, so many villagers didn't bother to take part in the parade. "Is there some kind of meaning in having 6 lanterns?" Kakashi asked, and Nanera looked at him curiously. "It's to give thanks to the sage of the 6 paths." "You didn't know that?" First I've heard of it." "Well, it's about the same as not knowing about the 6th Hokage, I guess." Nodding, Nanera ripped up the grass at his feet, not knowing what to do with his hands. "I guess you only read hard things like maps and books about plants. You're not interested in stories." "That's not true." "Then what's your favorite story?" Kakashi suddenly grew serious. After thinking for a while, he opened his mouth slowly. "It's hard to narrow it down to just one. But my top story'd have to be Make Out Paradise." "Make Out Paradise?" Nanera frowned. "That's a weird title." "It's a masterpiece. Once you grow up and you can read more characters, I'll lend it to you." Kakashi sounded excited now. "Was it that good of a book?" Nanera tossed the grass toward the river and flopped down on the ground. Stars spread out across his field of view like pieces of ice scattered across the sky. "So then what relationship does this sage of the 6 paths have with this country?" Kakashi asked. "There's this legend," Nanera told him. "A long time ago, we had no water. The whole country was in real trouble. There were always water shortages, especially in the area around the capital. And then the sage of the 6 paths came along. He gave the king of the land of Ridaku this amazing tool. The sage of the 6 paths put the power of water inside of it. But it wasn't like just anybody could come along and use it. Only the person who inherited the throne. When the king waved the tool around, rain began to fall and the whole country was wet." Nanera noticed the 5th lantern approaching and sat up. "Ever since, generations of kings have used the power of this tool to make the rivers swell and rain fall. I guess." Kakashi was the one who had asked about it in the first place, but his reaction was somehow lackluster. Nanera peered quietly at the profile of his elusive tutor. Kakashi's eyes were slowly following the vine boat floating down the river. His eyes reflected the flickering orange of the lamp so that it looked almost like the shadow of a flame inside of a glass jewel was locked up in his pupils. It's just a fairy tale, though. I don't know if there actually was a sage of the six paths. But the tool really exists. I saw my dad use it a bunch of times. When he waved the golden staff, it would rain. So now that your older sister's the queen, she uses it, right? Kakashi asked. She's supposed to, Nanira agreed without hesitation. He hadn't been back in the capital once since he came to Nagar. But he was sure she was carrying out her official duties wonderfully. Because she was his serious and smart big sister, and he was proud of her. End of chapter 1. Thank you for listening. Remember to like and subscribe for lots more.